Hey everybody, this is Father Minsal, Jesuit priest and teaching senior year philosophy at Belen Jesuit Preparatory School. I've brought onto this Zoom recording a dear friend of mine and a fellow teacher at our brother school in New Orleans, Jesuit High School of New Orleans. This is Dr. Jed Delahoussaye, and Dr. Delahoussaye is a teacher of juniors morality. And we go a few years back, actually, when I first started teaching was in New Orleans, and he was kind of a mentor to me. And he was actually the first person to introduce me to Boethius, our new and dearly beloved friend in this class. So as a setup to this, I thought we'd kind of have an interview with him and just go over several parts that are going to prepare us to understand better Boethius and the consolation of philosophy. So without further ado, Dr. Delahoussaye, if you'd like to say anything here briefly.
No, I think we should, we'll get rolling.
Okay, so the Allegory of the Cave is basically a story kind of told on two levels, as we've seen and covered. It has the literary or literal level, and then also the deeper symbolic meaning. And on its literal level, it's kind of weird and obscure just because it has everyone starting off as prisoners in the bottom of a cave, staring at shadows. But Plato is ultimately kind of giving us the allegory because he's trying to teach us a deeper lesson about freedom, about education, about liberation and true knowledge. That knowledge is not simply understanding something according to vague shadows or impressions of things, but actually knowing the things themselves. So if you wanted to set up the allegory in another way.
I think you could add to what Father's already said, is that it is an allegory. Allegories are told on two levels, the narrative level and a symbolic level. And the symbolic level is the important level, the most important level. So the ugly duckling on the narrative level, it's about birds. On a symbolic level, it's about human beings. And the same is true of the cave, that on a narrative level, it's about people literally in a cave with an opening and the sun above them. But on the symbolic level, it is really the human condition and the plagues on the human condition, those things that blind us to the truth, whether it be folly or foolishness or ignorance or bias or you name it. You could go on and list a host of things that and problems that blind us to the truth. So, and you could also add that these things are not simply outside of us, but they are inside of us as well. That just as outside of us, we know that we are being in some ways manipulated and not told the truth in many different ways, and that there are things that deceive us, interpretations of reality, interpretations of what is in fact the case or not the case. We also know that inside of us, we are doing this to ourselves, that we produce our own misinterpretations of ourselves, of the external world. And these misinterpretations are hard on both levels to catch because normally they're not totally false. If something was totally false, it would be fairly, one would presume, easy to recognize. The challenge is that most of these things that keep us from the truth, these illusions or delusions or biases or our own selfishness, produce that we tell ourselves things that are mixes of truth and falsity. Therefore, it's hard to tell for us when the truth ends and the falsity begins, or when the falsity ends and when the truth begins.
Yeah, I really like that insight because I think there's a tendency sometimes to read the allegory as, you know, we're being oppressed by others, maybe the media, by false teachings of what the good is, but there's something of our own complicity in it. and we kind of choose to remain sometimes with an easier truth or with a simpler, more comfortable truth, perhaps.
Right.
And so a part of it is also a liberation of oneself. It's not just someone else, one's parents or one's social upbringing, but yeah, there's a complicity that we have to face, and maybe that's the more difficult one. Is not simply identifying the oppressor, but subjugating ourselves to a higher truth that may not immediately be available or as clear, but it is required for the sake of our goodness and understanding. So I wanted to go up to talk a little bit about these two worlds, the cave and this natural world that exists outside of the cave, where there are no shadows, where everything is clear and under the light. And maybe if we could talk a little bit more about that distinction. I have students, for example, Dr. Delahoussaye, that'll say, well, you know, how do we know that there is this ultimate form of beauty, for example? Isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder? They'll say, well, there are many different forms of goodness in this world. How is it that we're supposed to tell, or how do we know that there is an ultimate good that kind of maybe rules over all or encompasses all? Right. So anyways, if we could just talk a little bit more about this distinction between the cave and the symbolic meaning of the cave and the symbolic meaning of the natural realm.
Right. Yeah, for Plato would might start from a very experiential level and say, and ask us a question. In everything that each of us does, in any type of thoughtful way, are we seeking something good, right? And he would answer, I would agree with him. I mean, there's always room for argument, but it seems, it seems convincing to think that in everything we do, we strive for something good, and that we only do evil as a means to getting the good. We never seek evil as an end in itself, right? The something as evil is desired as a means to attaining something good, right? So on one level, Plato is saying we're already directed towards the good, and we can't escape from that direction. That's our hardwiring. That's our programming. So everything we do is framed in terms of the good. And then he would say, we are capable of knowing eternal truths, changeless truths that remain always the same. So, if I should let go of my watch, it's not like it might fall, it might not, it will necessarily fall, given the causal conditions in which I'm dropping it, right? That given where I'm dropping it, on what planet I'm dropping it, or letting it go, maybe is a better way of saying it. If I let this watch go, it will not maybe fall, it will necessarily fall. So that's a necessary truth. We do know, it's easier in science, but we do know necessary truths. And Plato is also aware that in reality, certain perfections cannot be attained. And yet we have the idea of the perfection. So you take the idea of a wheel, here like the wheel of a car, for instance. We know that a wheel is round, and the axle is in the center of the wheel, right? We also know that a absolutely perfect wheel would be a perfectly round object with the axle at absolute dead center. Now we also know that there is no perfect wheel in reality, because we would make the wheel out of something physical, and that thing we could never shape into perfection. We could get very close, So modern tires last longer than tires made 40, 50 years ago, not only because we make better rubber, but the tires that we now make are more nearly round. So they roll with less friction, they roll more efficiently, so forth. But no, none of us can buy a tire for our car that is perfectly round. And yet we have this idea. So it cannot exist in the real world. But if I have the idea of a perfect wheel, I can critically assess every wheel that I see, right? How close to perfection is this wheel? Well, I can give a rough answer to that question because I know what the perfection of a wheel is, right? So in this area, of course, this is not a very contentious area at all. Plato is really always primarily concerned about morality. So he wants to say, what if we could attain the ideal perfect form of a human being? And then we could use that as a model or a measure to assess how to make a just city, how to structure a school. The best school would be the school that is truest to human nature, or the better school, the best. All schools are imperfect, but they will be filled with imperfections because they're filled with human beings. But we can, and human structures, but if we can get the human structure guiding a school as in line with the ideal human being as possible, then we will have a better school. If we can build a state which is as close as we can make it in aligned to the idea of justice, then we will have a better state. So having the idea of justice doesn't tell me what laws to make or what customs to sanction. But if I have it, I can better determine, at least I can hope to better determine what laws are we actually forming. Is the choice of laws that we actually have, which one would best serve justice, which would best serve the human being?
And yeah, and the analogy would remain that some laws may be very good, and just like a wheel may be very good, it may be a very good attempt at this idea, but its durability or its understanding or grasp or truth or true goodness may be limited and may be in need of adaptation and constant examination. But yeah, when I it's a helpful distinction. When I would give the example, I'd kind of talk about triangles and how there are different kinds in the material world of triangles. You've got right angle triangles, isosceles triangles of different shapes, sizes, and colors. Basically an infinite number of triangles, but they're all united and are constituted in the definition of a triangle, a mathematical definition. Just like you were saying, there's this idea of a wheel that is real, and that a triangle, by definition, is a three-sided figure whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees. And that this definition applies always and everywhere. So I think for Plato, as you're suggesting, is that this mathematical truth, just as the intellect is capable of grasping and discerning and considering this mathematical definition, which applies in every country of the world at all times of the universe, likewise, there should be, or at least the human mind is capable of discerning and grasping and considering what a definition of a just man looks like, what the good is. And if you wanted to add to that, but I wanted to ask a little bit more on the distinction too, to sharpen this between what the role of the sun is in the natural world, and how could we better understand what a form is. A form is a Platonic kind of epistemological term. But so what does Plato mean by the form, and what is this role that's played by the sun in the allegory of the cave?
Well, the form is just Plato's word for what we've been talking about, that these eternal truths, these eternal models, um, and he would think that it's an indication of why our mind or a part of us is eternal or immaterial, that we can't find these things in the external world, yet we can arrive at them intellectually. So for him, that's one reason to think that our souls are immaterial. There's some type of kinship between our souls and our minds and these objects that doesn't exist between my fingers and the flesh of my fingers and these objects. So Plato's big on definitions. So what is are naming things properly. And in order to name something properly, I must know the essence of it. What is eternally true of it, that and always true. So to talk about a form of a wheel or a human being or justice, is to talk about something that is all that is essential to something that always is true and always will be true of something. So if I know the essence of a human being, I know something that is eternally true, all what is eternally true about human beings, even if we should cease to exist, right? And the form of a wheel is true even if no actual wheels ever existed. So for Plato, these are key in intellectual rigor, in assessing the reality in front of us. The cave is not about, that what is in front of us is an illusion. The cave is about our interpretations of what is in front of us. And they can be illusory or full of half-truths. So this is the problem of the cave, is that the material world needs interpreting. We must interpret it. Truth is hidden from us, and it's a hard find. It's a hard thing to discover. Just think about how long it took us to discover the chemical composition of salt, right? The effort it takes to really discover the inner reality of the world around us. So this is the importance of these forms, because when you can find it, when we finally did discover what is of the essence of salt, we can now understand salt better, what it does well, what it happens in interaction, and so forth. So Plato would then go on to say that, going back to what we talked about earlier, that everything we seek in the name of the good. Plato will ask another question. Is it true, or do you think it's true, that everything, I emphasize thing, that you and I bump into in this world is good, right? There is no evil thing in itself, right? That's why there's no form of evil, because Plato would say everything that exists is in fact good. And he would say you cannot name one thing that is evil in itself. So if I was to give Father virtually a glass of poisoned water, okay, the poison is bad for Father. It's bad for you, it's bad for me. But in and of itself, it's something good. It just happens to damage the human being when you ingest it. But in and of itself, it's a good thing, worthy of examination, of interest, of curiosity. So, this is why St. Augustine, 1,000 years after Plato wrote, would define evil as the absence of good, as a non-thing. Evil is a non-thing. So this is Plato's insight that everything that exists, both in the material world and in the world of forms, is something good. And if everything is good and nothing, then and none of those things could exist on there without acknowledging that they're good, then there must be goodness itself on which everything is dependent. So because we can point to everything, whether it be hurricanes or chemicals that are poisonous, or chairs, books in the background, or everything we point to is good, Plato thinks that nothing in this world imperfectly good could exist unless there was an eternal model for it, which would be the good itself.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction, because I think we sometimes see the cave as maybe symbolic of maybe fallen reality and a fallen material world, which is the case. But more importantly, I think your distinction is taking at it's our interpretation and perception and our understanding of the things that are imperfect, that are shadowy, sometimes fictive or unclear and not distinct. But that the world is a source of our access to these eternal truths, to the form, and we can actually trust that they contain something of the good within themselves, something that is beautiful. In fact, everything has something of good and beauty in it. It's our perception or inability to perceive it sometimes that is the problem. So I'd like to turn to one more point too, about the role of the puppeteers. I like how you say that we're hardwired for the truth, and we're hardwired for goodness. This is proper to our knowing it, but and our searching for it, that we wish to discover these things, and we're capable of discovering these things even. But we have these puppeteers in the cave. And so what are these kind of puppeteers? The puppeteers we've discussed, you and I, they kind of have a maybe more sinister and cruel kind of interpretation, because they're seemingly deceptive or misguiding in some ways. So how do we understand the puppeteers at an allegorical level?
Right. Well, there's at least two ways of reading them, and maybe more. But one would be they are carrying artifacts, which is the normal translation of the Greek word. An artifact is something made by human skill. So they're not actually carrying tables and donkeys and elephants and so forth. They're carrying interpretations of reality, and these implicitly or explicitly, given the allegory, these interpretations are often faulty, if more often than not faulty. So you could have a sincere puppeteer who, sorry, phone's ringing, and sorry, I should not have a phone next to me. So the puppeteer could be someone who, in all sincerity, like you and I, or like the people outside of us, right, walk around sincerely believing these interpretations are correct, faultless, right? And they sincerely broadcast this to others, right? Just as, I sincerely believe things about myself, which, unknown to me, I'm sure, are in fact erroneous, wrong, probably convenient, comforting, and I don't see through that comfort. Now, sometimes too, I guess they can be brutally negative in an excessive way, right? So the young girl who thinks she's not attractive until she's skinnier and skinnier and skinnier is holding up an interpretation of herself as an anorexic. The anorexic is holding up an interpretation of herself, which is false, but which she sincerely believes, and of course leading to very tragic consequences. So the interpretations we should add are not always flattering. Sometimes we can interpret things in a false and very harshly negative way. So you could have someone who's a sincere puppeteer, You could also have someone like Gyges, or the ancestor of Gyges in the story, who is the puppeteer and who is radically insincere, who thinks that out in the sun there may be scientific truths or other things that are objectively true. But for someone like Gyges, morality, there's no guides, absolute truth or guides to morality outside of the cave. That morality is just a human product, and it's actually a bunch of baloney. So he becomes a very sinister puppeteer, because unlike the prisoner who comes back in the cave who wants to liberate people, and for Plato, this would have been an intellectual elite that would have come back into the cave and attempted to liberate as many people as he could. And if he was able, would have broken the chains of everyone in the cave. But Gyges wants to keep people in chains. He wants you to continue to believe what he knows to be false, because you are predictable, manageable. So Gyges wants a world full of goody two-shoes, Mr. and Mrs. Goody two-shoes, who buy into morality, therefore make their behavior predictable, and therefore are more easily manipulated by Gyges. So this is one reason why the cave should be read along with the Ring of Gyges. That the person that Plato fears the most is someone who doesn't want to illuminate someone else, but wants to keep people in chains for their own advantage. No matter what those chains are, to keep people sincerely believing things that are false, that are useful for the person who is projecting these illusions.
Yeah, and not to totally kind of get ahead and go too far into Ring of Gyges, but it's precisely this, is that what matters is my appearance of being just rather than actually being just itself. And so what is important is that I give a projection, or I meet sufficient standards according to other people or according to societal standards of justice, but not that I maybe go above and beyond the call of duty, or that I surpass the justice that the state or any particular culture of any given time asks of me. So only insofar as I comply with kind of the minimum, then I've kind of met sufficient standard of justice. But it's very much a world ruled heavenly entirely, or almost completely, by appearances and not by the things themselves. And I think Gyges would be very happy to encourage the prisoners that there is no natural world, there's nothing beyond the cave, and that the truth that governs is the one that you kind of want to have told, or the one that you want to listen to, or maybe the one that most people decide to listen to at any given point in time that may not ask much of you.
Right. Gyges is the perfect or the most sinister con man. You can't con people if they know you're conning them. So you have to appear honest.
Right.
And so he is a consummate liar, the consummate deceiver, who is conning you for his own purposes, who recognizes that there is really no justice, or that the good for Gyges is simply something he can fill up with his own personal wishes. And because there's no objective right or wrong, his personal wishes for him is all that matters. He's not measuring himself against the truth, or he's not concerned about lying, because he doesn't think lying is in and of itself wrong. That's what simpletons believe. That's what the naive believe. Where, to quote a phrase from a famous philosopher you might read later on, is that, he is above good and evil. He's enlightened. Everybody else is naive, or most people are naive, and he wants them to keep that. He wants to keep them that way.
Mhm. Great. Yeah. So I'll make just one more point, and then if you would like to kind of conclude Allegory of the Cave with anything, we'll be wrapping up from here. But to me also, it seems important and related to the first thing that you said at the very beginning was that we're all kind of hardwired for the good and hardwired for the truth. To me, I like to read Plato's Allegory of the Cave in terms of this doctrine of recollection. It's very Platonic and very much part of Socrates' teaching methodology, and that it's basically that I read also the prisoner as not necessarily just a physical person, but maybe as a soul. The bodily prisoner is an allegory really for the soul that each of us has, and it's the role of the philosopher not to teach something as kind of external to the person, but rather to draw from within. Because, as you said at the very beginning, I just think it's so crucial that we're hardwired, we're kind of destined to know this immaterial world, that we're capable of grasping these truths. What is the good? What is justice? How do we define justice? And that the philosopher is one who helps kind of extract, not impose from without, but extract from within this hardwiring that we have for the good. So it's kind of like a healing role. It's and one that helps heal our vision, helps heal our sight, helps us see clearly, right? We say, I see something. That's because I understand it deeply, at a deeper level. It's not just that I have a visual of it, but no, I understand something of it. And this is ultimately, I think, the role of the philosopher for Plato, is the one who helps people move from opinion to knowledge and understanding of that which is good and that which is true, that which is beautiful. I'll give you the final words, Dr. Delahoussaye.
Yeah, I think that the body for Plato and the material world is an image or reflection of the forms, but the material is also an impediment to seeing clearly. And in some ways, he's desperate to get out of the body and to be free of the body. So unlike the Christian who hopes to have we hope with the resurrection to have an improved body. You know, I go from my, Hyundai Escort to a Maserati or something like that. But I need my body, and it's important that I have it. We will have, from Christ's resurrection appearances, it seems that our new bodies will have powers that our current bodies don't have. But it's essential to us that we need a body. So that's a point very different in Plato. And also for Plato, he thinks that somehow we existed, since we're immaterial, in some type of prior immaterial vision of these eternal truths. Because true knowledge for Plato is absolute knowledge. Just where in the world today in science and other things, we tend to work with probabilities rather than certainties, but Plato is really true knowledge is of these forms, not of the world in front of us, so to speak. But we can't understand the world in front of us without these forms. So later on, when Augustine picks up from Plato, he will say that we did not live in a previous life, but somehow God imprints these forms in our minds, that we have some access to them that doesn't come from the external world, but we access them mentally, right? So, and continue what Father was saying is that, you know, our notion of concept comes from sexual reproduction. To conceive of something, to have a concept, is to give birth to something in your mind. And Plato thinks that these things, these immaterial, these forms that we give birth to, that we conceive in our mind, could not possibly come from the external world. But that the whole point of the philosopher is to be a midwife. That's one of his favorite images for Socrates, to help us give birth, conceive, to give birth to concepts, the conceptions that are true conceptions that will allow us to better, they won't guarantee, but will allow us to better run our lives, both interior, both from the inside and looking out in the exterior world.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that not only are we destined to know these things, but there's even something of our origin that's of this immaterial realm, of this transcendent realm, and therefore at the same time shaping our ultimate destiny. So, all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Delahoussaye. Appreciate it very much. God bless. See you next time.
God bless.